documenting an API is important. For publicly available APIs, this goes without saying. But when an API is not publicly available, it should also be documented. Imagine you're building an API for your fellow developers or one that will be used by other teams in the company. There's of course the fact that you don't want to spend your time answering the same question, how do I integrate with this API, over and over again. Time is money. But there's more. If the API isn't correctly documented, other teams in the company might not know what it does and start developing it themselves. In the end, that results in 3 or 4 APIs doing mainly the same thing, and thus a lot of money is wasted on developing and maintaining them. Through Swagger or OpenAPI, you can solve this. A lot of people have heard of Swagger or seen it in action, and know that it's that thing that allows documenting an API, amongst others. It's in fact the de facto standard these days, and I'm assuming that's why Microsoft chose to include it in its default templates. Let's see what drives this. What you're looking at the moment is part of an OpenAPI specification in JSON. In fact, it's the specification generated for our API. In essence, this is a standardized description of your API, either in JSON or YAML format. It describes the capabilities of your API and how to access it through HTTP. If we have something like that, we can have tools and components that use that description or specification to do something with it. The most common example being generating a documentation UI from it. So that's the story. We have a specification, and from that specification, a documentation UI, like a web app, can be generated. But unless we want to manually write such a specification, we need some kind of component or tool that generates that specification by inspecting our API. That's our first requirement. And then we need another component that does something with that specification. For example, generate that documentation user interface from it that can also be used to test our API. So that's our second requirement. We'll get to how we can meet these requirements immediately, but first let's clear up some potential terminology confusion. Because over the years, terms like Swagger, OpenAPI, and Swagger UI have not always been used correctly. An OpenAPI specification is often referred to as a Swagger specification as well. Both terms are interchangeable, but OpenAPI is the preferred term. Swagger then is sort of an umbrella term. It's a set of open source tools built around that OpenAPI specification. These are tools that help with creating an OpenAPI specification, like Swagger Editor, tools that help with rendering a UI from an OpenAPI specification, an example of that is Swagger UI, or even tools that help with generating client libraries from that specification. Alright, back to those two requirements. We need some kind of tool or component that helps with working with OpenAPI in ASP.NET Core. That's where Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core comes in. This piece of middleware has two main responsibilities. First, it generates an OpenAPI specification for our API. That matches our first requirement. And secondly, it acts as a wrapper around Swagger UI. It provides an embedded version of it which is driven by the generated OpenAPI specification. And that is a match with our second requirement. So, if we add Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core to our API project, we get both of these. Let's have a look at a demo for that.